Shalom, shalom, shalom. It's your brother Priest Daniela. Right back at you. Let's get right into it. Today's topic is called Luke 16, the parable of the rich man and the beggar. Is a parable. It 100% is a parable. Now, I hear brothers all the time telling people that it's a parable, even though it doesn't say it's a parable. Well, what I'm here to tell you today is that the scriptures actually do tell us that this is a parable. But what the problem is that a lot of brothers and sisters don't know the history of how the Bible was put together. So you wouldn't understand why I'm saying that it says it's a parable. So right now what we're looking at a very popular website called blueletterbible.com. And we're looking at an article that was written, Why is the Bible divided into chapters and verses? You need to know this history to be able to prove that Luke 16 is a parable, if someone is persistent. All right. So let's read this article because it's very relevant. It says, when the books of the Bible were originally written, there were no such things as chapters or verses. Each book was written without any breaks from the beginning to the end. So can you imagine how archaic that is when you're trying to find something in a Bible like that with no chapters and no verses right all the way through? A long book like Psalms, a long book like Isaiah or Jeremiah. Are you kidding? All right, let's continue. They have been divided for convenience. The chapter and verse divisions were added to the Bible for the sake of convenience. There is no authoritative basis for the divisions we now find. Okay, let's move on. The chapters added in the 13th century. A man named Stephen Langdon divided the Bible into chapters in the year AD 1227. Langton was a professor at the University of Paris, and later he became the Archbishop of Canterbury. So that's when the Bible was divided into chapters. Again, but if you look at a chapter like, let's say, Psalms 119, you see how long that is? It's still hard to find things if the Bible is only split into chapters. Let's read the next paragraph. The first Bible with chapters and verse divisions, the first entire Bible in which these chapter and verse divisions were used was Stephen's edition of the Latin Vulgate in 1555. The first English New Testament to have both chapters and verse divisions was the Geneva Bible in 1560. Fortunately, Jewish scholars have followed the way of dividing the Hebrew scripture into chapters and verses. That's why now you can go into the Torah and you can also see the verses are numbered inside of a lot of modern Torahs as well. All right, it wasn't always that way. Continuing on to the next the next paragraph. They are helpful for reference and quotation. The chapter and verse divisions are convenient for reference and quotation purposes. They make it easier to find certain statements and accounts in scripture, yet the chapter and verse divisions can cause a number of problems. One of the problems we're going to see is with Luke 16, because Luke 16 is actually a part of Luke 15, which is actually a part of Luke 14, which I'm going to show you. Let's continue. They are human made. It must always be remembered that the divisions into chapters and verses are human made. They are sometimes arbitrary, and they sometimes interfere with the sense of the passage. That's why Luke 16 will not tell you that it's a parable, because Luke 16 is actually a part of Luke 15, which is actually a part of Luke 14. And you could clearly see at the beginning of those chapters, it tells you that Christ was speaking to the people in parables. All right, let's continue. The first step in Bible interpretation is to ignore the modern chapter and verse divisions. You have to ignore that. Okay, and so you Christians out there that's trying to use Luke 16 literally, you need to ignore that because it is a parable. Let's continue. The divisions in chapters and verses can actually cause some problems. There are instances where chapters are wrongly divided. For example, the end of Matthew 6, chapter 16 should actually be placed with the beginning of Matthew chapter 17. Jesus said. So, let's see, what else is there? Let's just go right down to the summary. Y'all can come to this website and read it for yourself. Y'all can see that this is on blueletterbible.org. And you can just type in, just Google, why was the Bible separated into chapters and verses? And this is the first article that'll come up. Let's read this last two paragraphs, and we're going to go right to the Bible. I'm going to show you something else. The original authors of scriptures did not intend that their writings be divided up into chapters or verses. They intended that the books be read straight through from the beginning. A number of books of scripture can be read through in one sitting. This is the best way to discover what the author is trying to say. Dividing up the scripture into chapters and verses encourages people to read only small parts at a time. This is not always helpful. That's true. That's why a lot of people don't understand Paul's writings, because Paul's writings were letters. And now the letters or the epistles or letters of Paul have also been divided into chapters and verses, and that's why people don't understand them. It's the same for the same exact reason. Reading on, last paragraph. In the original text of the various books of the Bible, there are no such things as chapter and verse divisions. They were added later for the sake of convenience. While they are helpful, they are not authoritative in any sense of the term. Very important. So when someone tells you that Luke 16 is its own chapter and that chapter is talking about hell, that's not authoritative, because that wasn't always separated from the rest of the chapters. Let's read on. In fact, they cause a number of problems. Chapters and verse divisions give the impression that the scriptures should be read and studied in bits and pieces. This is not what the original authors intended. The entire context must always be considered. Consequently, the chapter and verse divisions should be ignored when one attempts to properly interpret the entire message of scriptures. And that's very, very important, because when studying the Bible, you must understand three things. You must understand subtext, you must understand context, and you must understand supertext. And when you add in, and if you don't know what those things are, brothers and sisters, that's homework. Context, subtext, and supertext. That's homework for you. Now, when dealing with modern day Bibles with chapters and verses added in, sometimes you lose the supertext of scripture. Sometimes you also lose the context of scripture. You might be able to deal with subtext, but you lose context and supertext when you start adding chapters and verses. Again, they're convenient. They're convenient. They help us all. We all know how to call out of scripture. Give me Jeremiah 14:2. Give me this. Give me that. So they make it easy for us. But sometimes, as a result of them having been added in, it causes problems with the context of the scriptures. And Christians take scriptures like Luke 16 out of context and take it literally, when in actuality, it is just a parable, as I'm going to show you. All right? All right, brothers and sisters. So what we're looking at now is we're looking at Luke, the 15th chapter, and turn the page, and Luke chapter 16 in a regular Bible in black and white print. It doesn't really show you much. Turn back one page. It doesn't really show you much. You can't really see much here, right? Now let's look at a Bible with red writing in it. What do we see? Now it stands out a little better. That's how I got the understanding of what was going on here. When you look at Luke chapter 16, you see the way it starts out? It says, and he said also unto his disciples. What is this letting you know? This is letting you know that Luke chapter 16 is connected to Luke chapter 15. The only reason why they're separated is so that you and I, the reader, we can find verses that we're looking for. We can find precepts that we're looking for. But the way that the chapter starts off clearly indicates that this, Luke 16, is connected to Luke chapter 15. Why is that important? Because when you look at the Bible in Luke chapter 15, verse 1, it says, then drew near unto him all the publicans and sinners for to hear him. And the Pharisees and scribes murmured, saying, this man receiveth sinners and eateth with them. And he spake this parable unto them. The reason why you don't see Luke chapter 16 speaking about the fact that it's a parable is because Luke 16 is really a part of Luke chapter 15, and Luke chapter 15 tells you that Christ is speaking in parables. Why is he speaking in parables? Because he has an audience of scribes and Pharisees, and when they were around, Christ spoke in parables. So you Christians are going to have to give this whole thing up, because Luke chapter 16 is what the Christians use to try to teach that fake hell doctrine by speaking about the rich man and the beggar. And they're trying to say that when you die, you go to hell. And brothers have been telling these Christians for years that Luke chapter 16 is a parable, but it just doesn't say. And the reason why brothers say it doesn't say is because brothers don't understand the concept of why the Bible was separated into chapters and verses. It's not to separate the thought, it's to separate it so that you can find it. But Luke 16 is a part of Luke 15, and Luke 15 clearly tells you right there that he spake unto them in parables. Really simple. Really simple. All right. So we're in the same article that I just read to y'all before, Why is the Bible separated into chapters and verses? Now, you just saw what you saw in the book of Luke chapter 16 and chapter 15. You just saw that Luke chapter 16 is a continuation of Luke chapter 15. All right, let's come back and let's read this. Let's read this right here, this little article right here. All right. This paragraph right here. They are human made. It must always be remembered that the divisions into chapters and verses are human made. They sometimes are arbitrary and they sometimes interfere with the sense of the passage. We just saw that with Luke chapter 16 and Luke chapter 15. The separation kind of interfered with the sense of the passage because you lose out on the fact that it's a parable because it told you that in chapter 15. All right. The first step in Bible interpretation is to ignore the modern chapter and verse divisions. That's why you have to ignore the fact that Luke chapter 16 doesn't start off by telling you it's a parable, but you can look at the first sentence and you can put two and two together to see that it's picking up where chapter 15 left off. And chapter 15 starts off by telling you it's a parable. All right, let's read the next paragraph. They can cause problems, right? The divisions into chapters and verses can actually cause some problems. There are instances where chapters are wrongly divided. We just saw one. For example, the end of Matthew chapter 16 should actually be placed with the beginning of Matthew chapter 17. Jesus said, I tell you the truth, some who are standing here will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. Matthew chapter 16, verse 28. The next verse reads, after 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and his brother John, Peter, James, and John, the brother of James, and led them up into a mountain by themselves. That's Matthew 17, verse 1. These verses should have been in the same chapter as the previous verse since it is continuing the story. I hope that's clear for y'all, brothers and sisters. That's the same thing that we see in Luke chapter 16. So to make a long story short and to make this video very short, we don't see the word parable in Luke 16 because Luke 16 is connected to Luke chapter 15, but it was only separated to make it easier for you to find the verses. And Luke 15 clearly tells you that it is parables that Christ was speaking. Why was he speaking parables? Because you had the publicans and the Pharisees in the audience. That's why he was speaking in parables. I really hope this is clear. I hope it's clear. All right? With that, I say shalom to the family.